The world is staring at an uncertain future, with global weather patterns becoming erratic and extreme. And now scientists have announced the arrival of a climate phenomenon, El Nino. It is raising fears of extreme weather and record temperatures. So what will be the impact of this phenomenon? Here's a report.
The world is flirting with disaster as it stands at a perilous moment. Wildfires, droughts, cyclones and extreme weather conditions are becoming frequent, pushing the planet into a dangerous zone. In India, farmers await the first drops of rain to cultivate their land. India's southern states are at last seeing first signs of showers days after monsoon was delayed. This was India's longest delay in 7 years. India receives 70 to 90% of its annual rainfall during the monsoon season. The rains are crucial for agrarian economies and for global food production. In essence, our lives. But the global rainfall pattern works on the seasonal dance of clouds, which brings in the drops to the parched lands. But all these can go haywire due to El Nino, a natural climate phenomenon that fuels tropical cyclones in the Pacific and boosts rainfall and flood risks in parts of the America and elsewhere. Well, the United States Weather Department has declared an El Nino is now underway. The past 3 years have been dominated by the cooler La Nina pattern. Countries across the world are bracing for its impact. But what causes El Nino to occur, and why is it so worrisome? El Nino is a natural phenomenon that is triggered by unusually warm waters in the eastern Pacific region. It causes an abnormal volume of warm water to accumulate in the western Pacific and moves over to the eastern side of the ocean.
El Nino is not like a storm. El Nino is not going to hit you on Tuesday. El Nino is all about changing the kind of patterns that weather plays in. So when we talk about a moderate or strong event, that's basically saying that El Nino has a stronger influence on creating the atmospheric patterns that might stay around a while for a period of time. So the stronger an El Nino, that usually means the more consistent impacts that we would normally see during an El Nino.
Scientists say this year looks particularly worrying. The last time a strong El Nino was in full swing was in 2016. The world saw its hottest year on record. Meteorologists expected that this El Nino, coupled with excess warming from climate change, will see the world grapple with record high temperatures. The term El Nino was first used by fishermen of Ecuador and Peru for warm waters around Christmas at the time. El Nino was known to occur once every 3 to 7 years, but its frequency has now increased, and worryingly so. According to scientists, the phenomenon has become more intense since the late 20th century, and there are no signs of it slowing down. Experts are also concerned about what is going on in the ocean.
So it's kind of almost a double whammy. You have warming oceans due to climate change, and then you have another thumb on the scale of warming related to El Nino, which can really be quite dangerous for corals across a large portion of the South Pacific and getting into parts of the Western Pacific even too.
An El Nino means that waters in the eastern Pacific are warmer than usual. But even before this El Nino began in May, the average global sea surface temperature was about 0.1 degrees Celsius higher than any other on record. That could supercharge extreme weather. Clearly, we're entering an uncharted territory. Bureau Report WION World is One.
And for more on this, Dr. Vishwas Chaitale, who is the Senior Program Lead at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, joins us live from New Delhi. Welcome to the broadcast, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, give us a sense of the severity of the situation here. You know, even before El Nino began, the average global sea surface temperature was higher than any other on record. So how much severe is the situation going to be?
Yeah, thanks. As you're aware, just yesterday, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Division, also known as NOAA, declared the onset of El Nino, which in fact has started earlier than the predicted. And as you rightly mentioned, and as we saw earlier this year, in April, the average sea surface temperature was already exceeding the record high of 21.1 degrees Celsius, which is the highest ever recorded since 2016. So, I mean, we are really talking about kind of an urgency of the situation here to talk about more on climate change and the impacts.
Sir, how is El Nino going to impact specific regions, the Americas, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent? You know, Indian monsoons are already delayed. They just hit yesterday after a 7-day delay. It was a delay which has been the longest in the last 7 years. What impact, if any, is El Nino likely to have on Indian monsoons? That's the lifeblood of the country's economy.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, for example, whenever El Nino occurs, generally it brings a lot of unexpected weather conditions in different parts of the world. So the areas which might face very wet weather or excessive rainfall, for example, Argentina, Chile, or Peru, might have a lot of rainfall which is not expected in this part of this time of the year. Whereas when we are talking about monsoon rains arriving pretty soon in India, this El Nino effect might have or might bring some dry weather to India, Australia, as well as Indonesia, Brazil, as well as Colombia. So, as you rightly mentioned, like to talk about the impact of El Nino on Indian monsoon, I think it's really important that we understand the degree of influence El Nino has on Indian monsoon. What El Nino does is basically it weakens the trade winds, which directly impacts the monsoon rains in India. And as you also mentioned about the IMD forecast, which just came yesterday as well for the rest of the June, we have already seen that we have received 57% below average rainfall so far in first week of June this year. And although IMD has predicted a normal monsoon this year, we really have to be careful and take a proper prediction in consideration with this El Nino kicking in. And then we really have to see when the impact really starts becoming visible. Is it later of the June or early July when we are going to when we are going to see a more weaker monsoon probably this year?
Weaker monsoon is not good news for India, but how do you think countries should prepare themselves for the impacts of El Nino? You mentioned Peru. Now, Peru has in fact set aside $1.06 billion to deal with El Nino's impacts. Now, a study says that this weather phenomenon may lead to global economic losses of a staggering $3 trillion. So do you think that countries should think about budgeting and keeping money aside to deal with the impacts of El Nino?
Exactly. I mean, it is the most important part when countries are dealing with such severe impacts of climate change. And also, I mean, there are 2-3 ways of doing it. One, of course, India in its G20 presidency this year formed for the first time the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group. And there has been a lot of debate, a lot of talk on how to increase the budget for preparedness to deal with such impacts of climate change. And currently, if you see, India's National Disaster Management Plan allocates approximately 10% of its budget for preparedness-related activities. But I mean, considering the more intense frequency as well as intensity of these kind of events coming in next few years, we really have to revisit this budget and probably bring it to a figure that can justify actual preparedness activities to deal with such impacts. Another is also like, for example, just yesterday I heard the news that ICAR, the Indian Council on Agricultural Research, has launched 150 varieties of drought-resistant crops. So now this is something that is going to really help farmers, help everyone to ensure the food security when we talk about more drought conditions in coming years. So I mean, we really have to revisit these kind of budget allocations and to act more on this for better preparedness in India.
So you spoke about climate change. Now, I want to understand, are there studies that look into whether climate change is affecting El Nino? And if so, how much of an impact is that having, the climate change having on El Nino?
Yeah, I mean, as you see, climate change increases the temperatures overall across the world, which in a way also increases the temperature of the oceans. Now, when we are talking about ocean warming, it basically kind of absorbs all the heat that we are emitting due to anthropogenic factors. And then when ocean starts warming, then it's kind of affecting the rains, the rain patterns, the weather patterns in different parts of the world. So it's like a complete cycle. If we are talking about increasing impacts or increasing severity of climate change, it's going to come and hit us back in terms of more drought conditions and more floods. So I think, also in one of the recent studies at CW, what we have seen is something interesting, which is called as a swapping pattern in terms of disasters. Some parts of India which was facing drought earlier are either facing floods, or also in addition to the droughts, they are also facing floods. So these kind of disaster patterns are also changing in a very short time cycle, which needs to be considered in planning and budgeting when we talk about taking proper measures for preparedness.
Sir, one final question to you. I want to understand, how does this happen? You spoke about swapping patterns. Scientists say that during an El Nino, the southern United States, for example, experiences cooler and wetter weather, while parts of the US West and Canada are warmer and drier. Not just that, some parts of Central and South America experience heavy rainfall, although the Amazon rainforest tends to suffer from drier conditions. And Australia faces extreme heat, drought, even bushfires. So how does that happen? Some areas are relatively cooler, the other face a warmer sort of a temperature there.
Yeah, this is really particularly, when the El Nino starts occurring, so it all depends on its intensity, how strong is it going to impact the different parts of the world. And then basically when it starts pushing the trade winds towards Western Pacific Ocean, if suddenly there are certain disturbances that occur in between, the winds don't end up reaching to the Western Pacific, rather they stay somewhere in between. So that's why we see this peculiar pattern of certain parts of the world having some really wet conditions. At the same time, certain parts like also Australia, Indonesia, India, facing really dry weather conditions at the same time of the year.
All right, Dr. Vishwas Chathule, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective on this story.
Thank you.